Hello, kiddies. This is John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. Okay, boils and ghouls, you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian. And guess what? I better return that book I borrowed from them. Their late fees are a killer.
Be seen in your dream.
When I want you in my arms, when I want you, and all your charms. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream, 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 dream. When I feel blue in the night and I need you to hold me tight. Whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream.
Just remember,
I can make you mine, taste your lips of wine, anytime, night or day. The only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm dreaming my life away. I need you so that I could die.
Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams. Miles to go before I sleep. In the dream, he was whole again, and as he walked down the sunny street, head high, thinking of his wife, he felt good and proud, and he knew with the certainty born of security that Barbara was all his, that she would never even look at another man. He looked down at his fingers. They were long, extraordinarily so, unnaturally so, but they curved gracefully in a way that seemed somehow sensuous. He wiggled the fingers of his left hand. They responded in the commands of his brain, but they did so on a delay, a beat or two behind his thoughts. He glanced up, and there was Barbara. She was standing in the middle of the sidewalk wearing the swimsuit he had bought for her on their honeymoon in California. To the left he could see a house, a 2-story house, white with green trim. He had never seen the house before, but there was something about it that he liked, that made him feel good. "I love you," Barbara said. He hugged her, his long fingers caressing the skin of her back, and she pressed against him as their lips met and they kissed. Ed awoke, frustrated, his body tense and sweating. He looked at Barbara lying next to him on the bed, her bare shoulder peeking out from beneath the blankets. He breathed heavily for a moment, then leaned back against the pillow, closed his eyes, and tried to will away the feelings within him. For the millionth time he cursed the accident that had cost him his manhood. He took a deep breath and reached for Barbara, but she pulled away from him, mumbling in her sleep, frowning. He stared at the back of her head, and against his will, alone on the far side of the bed, a tear escaped from underneath his eyelid, and he began to cry. At breakfast, everything was fine. Ed awoke first, showered and shaved, and by the time he had made the orange juice and started the eggs, both Barbara and Lisa had awakened and come into the kitchen. Barbara gave him a kiss on the cheek and a happy smile, and Lisa gave him a quick hug before sitting down at the table and fishing through the pile of newspaper for the entertainment section. It felt good being with his family like this, and at these moments he could almost convince himself that this was what was important. Being close, being together, caring. He could almost convince himself that sex was, after all, only a minor part of life. Almost. He looked at Barbara, staring out the window, drinking her juice. She was as beautiful now as she had been the day he'd married her. More beautiful, perhaps. There were a few wrinkles around the eyes, a few extra pounds around the thighs, but those were the natural results of life experience. and they added character and maturity to the superficial good looks of her youth. He would not be rationalizing if he said that her beauty now was deeper and more real than it ever had been before. That worried him sometimes. His eyes moved over to his daughter sitting on the opposite side of the table. Lisa knew of the accident, of course, but she did not know of his problem, and he doubted that she ever would. They had discussed it at length, he and Barbara, although they had never arrived at a decision. Based on past experience, however, based on how difficult it had been for either of them to discuss even the basics of sex with their child, he did not think it likely that they would ever get around to broaching the subject of his physical inadequacy. Not that she needed to know. After all, he had never known any details of his own parents' intimate lives, and he did not feel that it was something he should know. Some things were meant to be private. Lisa looked up from her newspaper, caught his eye, and smiled. "What is it, Daddy?" He shook his head. "Nothing." "Can I ride to school today with Keith and Alina?" He stared at her with an expression of mock hurt. "You're ashamed of me, aren't you? You're ashamed to be seen with your poor old father." "Knock it off, Daddy." He chuckled. "It's okay by me, if it's okay with your mother." "Mom?" Barbara nodded distractedly. "Fine, dear." "All right." Ed slid the spatula under the eggs on the frying pan, placed the eggs on a plate, and handed the plate to Lisa. "I'll be there early today, though, and if you're even a minute late, that's it. You ride with me for the rest of the year." She shook her head. "Don't be crazy." "Ed," Barbara said, "don't be overprotective." His comment was supposed to have been light-hearted, a joke, but although Lisa seemed to have understood that it was a joke, Barbara was taking it at face value. He frowned. She'd been doing that a lot lately, misunderstanding things, not seeing humor where it was intended. He had not changed since the accident, but she had, and it was as if the rhythm they had built up over the last 20 years had been thrown off. Comments he made that she would have previously understood, he now found himself having to explain them. He shook his head. Maybe it was him. Maybe he was just overreacting, reading into events interpretations that simply were not there. "I'm not overprotective," he found himself saying. Barbara looked up at him, smiled, and he suddenly felt foolish. "It was a joke," she said. "Oh!" He turned back toward the stove and cracked another egg into the frying pan. The yolk broke, and he watched as the yellow slid into the white in tentacled rivulets that for some reason reminded him of blood. Maintenance supervisor, janitor. Maintenance supervisor was technically the title of his job, the one that appeared on the tops of his annual reviews and on the single sheet of his job description, but he liked janitor better. It seemed more honest, more real, more descriptive of his actual duties. He was not sure which term Barbara or Lisa preferred. He had never asked them. He had the feeling that his wife and daughter were slightly ashamed of what he did. They had never said so, had never even indicated in any way that this was how they felt, but it was a persistent suspicion, and one which he could not seem to shake. Although he enjoyed his job, although he liked working at the school, being around the kids, he himself felt slightly guilty about his occupation. It seemed to him that his position was one that was supposed to be a way station, a temporary spot filled by young kids on their way up, and old men on their way down. Not the way to make a living for a middle-class, middle-aged man with a wife and daughter. But he liked his job. It was fun, did not require a great deal of thought or effort, and for a man of his age and education, it provided security, good benefits, and a decent living. What more could a person ask for? He rifled through his rings of keys until he found the one that opened the maintenance supply office. He walked into the underlit office, moving past the newspaper-covered desk to the bench shelf in the back where the fluorescent lighting tubes were kept. One of the lights had burned out in the art classroom yesterday, and the resultant shadows made it difficult for some of the beginning students to differentiate between closely related color shadings. He had not had time to get to the classroom after school, and before his shift ended, so he'd promised the teacher he'd fix the problem this morning before school started. Ed found a box with the proper size lighting tube, carried it into the hall, closed and locked the supply office behind him. He turned around and almost ran into Kathy Epstein, one of his daughter's best friends, and the only one who still lived on their street. "Sorry, Kathy," he said. "Didn't see you there." The girl looked at him, and her eyes widened. Her eyes darted from his chest to his face and back again. "Where did you get that sweater?" she asked. Her voice was high, shaky, and it sounded to him as though she was frightened. He looked down at the clothes he was wearing and saw that he had put on a red and green striped sweater. He could not recall making a decision to wear the sweater this morning, and could not recall where or when he'd bought it. He looked at Kathy and shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "I guess my wife must have bought it for me. Why?" She said nothing, only backed away, shaking her head, her face pale. He frowned. "Kathy," he said, "are you all right?" She held up a hand to stop his progress and tried to smile. "I'm fine," she said, but he could tell by the tone of her voice that she was lying. I have to go to Mr. Williams. I'll see you later." He watched her continue down the hall, then looked down again at his sweater. Was this what had frightened her? It hardly seemed possible. A sweater? He tugged on the material, pulling it tighter. He could not remember ever wearing this sweater before, but it looked good on him, and it felt comfortable. He shrugged, then continued down the hall toward the art room. Kathy Epstein did not breathe easy until she was safely out of the hallway and in her seat in algebra. She put her books on the rack under her seat, and only then did she realize that her hands were shaking. What was wrong with her? She had never been so frightened by a nightmare that the elements of its composition retained their horror in the waking world. But she had never before had a nightmare like the one she'd had last night. Goosebumps appeared on her arms even now as she thought of it. In the dream, she'd been going to a party at Lisa's house. She'd strode confidently up the walkway, opened the door, and stepped into the house. Inside, the party was in full swing, but there was no furniture in the house save a low, ugly table covered with a variety of drinking glasses, expensive crystal, average tumblers, empty jelly jars. She didn't recognize any of the people in the living room, so she walked through the crowd of partygoers into another room, and another, and another. The house was bigger than it was supposed to be, and she continued moving backward as the number of guests dwindled. Finally, she found herself in a small white room where Lisa was sitting in front of a computer terminal. The figure turned around, but it was not Lisa. It was a life-size Barbie doll. The doll grinned at her. Kathy turned and ran back the way she had come. In the living room again, at the front of the house, everyone was standing in a circle, cheering and clapping, while in the center of the circle an upright dead body spun like a top, blood flying outward and splattering against the walls, dripping into the drinking glasses on the table. Then the clapping and cheering stopped. The room grew silent. The lights dimmed. The only sound in the room was the whirling body and the falling blood. And he stepped into the room. Kathy could not remember having ever been so frightened in her entire life. The figure did nothing but stand there in the doorway, but his mere presence caused the temperature in the room to drop a good 20 degrees, and made even the party-goers, who a moment before had been celebrating the fall of blood from the spinning corpse, stand still and silent with terror. She stared at the figure, unable to look away. There was something so evil, so fundamentally wrong about this being, that she felt unclean and corrupt merely looking at him. His face was in the dark, hidden both by shadows and by that hat he wore low on his head, but she had the feeling that he was hideously deformed. Her eyes moved down. His fingers were long, unnaturally long and curved. She could see them silhouetted against the lighter night outside the door, and somehow those fingers scared her most of all. In the second before she'd awakened, screaming, the figure had turned, and she had been able to see the thick red and green stripes of his old sweater. The same sweater Mr. Williams had been wearing. Kathy looked around the room, reassuring herself with its light, with its people, with the concreteness of its existence. How could she let herself be so scared by a dream? So scared that she was frightened of a sweater worn by a man she'd known since she was a baby. Maybe she needed help, psychiatric help. Did teenagers go to psychiatrists? She shook her head. She wanted to put the nightmare behind her. to forget about it the way she usually did when she had a bad dream, but she didn't seem to be able to do so, because it seemed more like the remembrance of a real event than the memory of a dream. That was stupid, she told herself. She was behaving like a little child. But the thought would not go away, and she spent the rest of the day moving carefully between classes, avoiding Mr. Williams. A kid puked in the cafeteria, and though he quickly mopped it up with the soap and water that was already in his bucket, Ed knew he'd have to go back later with some heavy-duty Lysol and really scrub the spot clean. It was a busy day. In addition to his regular duties, he had to take over the work of Rudy Martinez, the other day janitor, because Rudy had called in sick, and it was after the bell rang and fifth period began before he finally had a chance to head over to the supply office. The way things were going, he'd probably be here until 6 tonight. The Lysol was not where it was supposed to be, on the floor next to the desk. He'd have to talk to the night workers about that. So he moved back into the stock shelves to look for it. Walking past the tools, he scanned the middle cleaning shelf for the familiar bottle, and his eyes alighted on the strange, half-hidden object he had found last week. A leather glove fitted with long, steel razor fingers. He stepped back as though shocked. He had forgotten all about the glove. He had come across it in the basement, buried amongst a pile of old rags near the corner of the incinerator, and he remembered now that he'd intended to talk to the principal about his discovery, to ask what should be done with the object. But somehow he had forgotten. He picked up the glove, holding it gingerly. The razor fingers, hanging limp, clicked together, making a satisfyingly martial sound. This, no doubt, had been the inspiration for his dream of long fingers, his dream of potency. He pulled on the glove. The fit was tight, but it was comfortable, and the long, still fingers did indeed make him feel more strong, more manly somehow, more powerful. From somewhere he heard the sound of a child humming, a vaguely familiar nursery rhyme tune which seemed at once innocent and chilling. He slashed the fingers once through the air, and the humming disappeared, replaced by a gratifying silence. He tapped the razors on the metal shelf. They clicked loudly and pleasantly, making a drum roll sound. He looked around, saw a sealed box on the top shelf above him. He reached up, and the fingers, long enough to reach the box, sliced cleanly and easily through the cardboard, causing a flood of pencils to spill out and onto his head. Ed smiled and took off the glove. The steel fingers, which had been extensions of his own shorter flesh and blood fingers, drooped impotently down as he replaced the glove on the shelf. The smile faded from his face. The happiness he had felt seconds before fled, replaced by an unsettling, empty feeling. He stared at the glove, at the brown-lined leather and the faded brilliance of the razors. The glove had fit him. But it was wrong somehow. It looked like a weapon, even though it had felt good on his hand. But yes, looking at it now, it seemed wrong somehow. Who would make a glove with razors for fingers? Who would even think of something like that? Some kid in shop class? He didn't think so. He'd stick to his original plan. Tell the principal about the glove. Let him decide what to do with it. Ed found the bottle of Lysol, took it from the shelf, and carried it out of the room. He stopped in the hallway, closed and locked the door behind him, then stood there for a moment slightly puzzled. He knew he had intended to go to Mr. Kinney's office and tell the principal something, but now for the life of him he could not remember what it was. He looked down at his hand, wiggled his fingers, and the missing information almost came to him. But then whatever he had been thinking faded away, receding into nothing. Oh well, it would come to him eventually. He picked up his mop and his Lysol, and started down the hallway toward the cafeteria. Lisa awoke in the hospital. Around her, she could hear the rhythmic pulsing beeping sounds of modern medicine in action. But she heard no voices, no people. She sat up and looked around and found herself in a long white room filled with sympathy flowers lined up by order of size along the wall. Aside from her bed and a bank of miniature television screens, all of which showed a solid red pattern. The room was devoid of furniture or medical instruments. She blinked. This did not look like any hospital room she had ever seen. She climbed out of bed, feeling slightly dizzy. Behind her bed she saw was a window. She walked over to the window and looked out. But behind the glass square she saw another hospital room, identical to her own save for the fact that the walls and bed were red and the bank of miniature TVs showed a solid white. In the bed was a life-sized Barbie doll. She turned away from the window and ran the length of the long room toward the door. She pulled open the door and dashed into the hallway, but immediately had to steady herself against the wall. Everything here was eerily off-center, sharply angular, wrong. Floor and wall and ceiling met in strangely peaked lines. The checkerboard floor, tile, a shifting optical illusion. A gurney sat in the center of the hallway, its metal joints held together in crooked junctions that should not have been possible. "Help!" Lisa cried. Her voice echoed, changing as it moved away from her, growing deeper and more assured, instead of dimmer and faint, until it was coming back toward her in a mode and manner that was truly terrifying. She ran down the hospital corridor, away from her echoing voice. She passed a glass-walled room. It had been a nursery, but the cribs and cradles had been broken and overturned, the bedding shredded. The lights were off, but even with only a quick glance she could see small, unmoving bodies thrown about on the floor. Along the shelf next to the window were 6 or 7 infants, lying naked in a row, facing away from the glass. Bloody triangle eyes and noses, wickedly grinning jack-o'-lantern mouths, had been carved into the backs of their bald baby heads. She ran faster, turned the corner, and there, standing before her, was the most terrifying creature she had ever seen, a monster in the shape of a man. Freddy. Freddy! She didn't know how she knew his name, but she did. And even worse, she knew what he wanted. She wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to run away, wanted to disappear, but she could only remain rooted in place, staring at the thing in front of her. Her heart pumped crazily in her chest, pounding so furious that she thought it was going to burst. She almost wished it would burst. Freddy stood there, rocking slightly on his heels, hands clasped behind his back. His face was a grotesque patchwork of interlocking scar tissue. He stared at her with small, cold eyes and smiled, revealing uneven rows of small, strange baby teeth, brown from rot, blackened from fire. His thick tongue, rough below the surface sliminess, was blood red in the black hole of his mouth, and it slid suggestively over the flat patch of melted skin that should have been his lips. "Lisa!" he said, and his voice was a low, inhuman growl. "I've been waiting for you. What took you so long?" He stepped forward, taking his hands from behind his back, and now she could see that the fingers of one hand were made out of razors, long, shiny razors that glinted in the cold antiseptic hospital light. They clicked together with deadly precision. "I knew we'd run into each other one of these nights. One of these crazy old nights." She smelled blood as he approached, blood and rot, and it was the smell more than anything else that gave her the courage to turn away from him and run. He laughed, a grating sound like sandpaper on steel wool, which built in intensity and echoed through the halls. She ran down one corridor, then another, turned right, turned left. She sped around a blind corner and found herself in a huge room filled with metal pipes and rusty tanks and staggered rows of industrial machinery. She stopped running. The air was cold, damp, filled with a heavily oppressive atmosphere that owed nothing to the physical elements of its surroundings. Above her, from the cavernous ceiling, hung scores of clanking chains, many of which ended in hooks. There was the sound of rhythmic pounding, a thunderous noise which increased in intensity, approaching, growing louder, getting closer, and beneath that another quieter yet far more frightening sound, the high-pitched screech of metal on metal, razor fingers scratching against pipe. She wanted to run, wanted to hide, but the rows between the machines all looked the same, and she knew that Freddy could be hiding down any one of them. She took a deep breath and screamed as loud and as long as she could. She was still screaming when she awoke from the dream. The nightmare was still with her when she walked out to breakfast. Ordinarily, she forgot her dreams instantly upon awakening. Even the good ones, the ones she wanted to remember, the ones about Phil Hogan and the bear rug and the cabin in the pines. She could not seem to recall, except in the vaguest possible way. But this nightmare was lodged in her consciousness and could not be displaced. She had even felt it returning last night as she'd started to drift back into sleep, and she'd forced herself to stay awake for the rest of the night to make sure she would not dream it again. Freddy. Before this, the name would probably have seemed goofy to her, slightly comical. She would have thought of the Flintstones, or perhaps that old record of her mother's by Freddy and the Dreamers. But this morning the name seemed as ominous as it had in her nightmare, carrying with it connotations of violent perversity and death. She slid into her chair, took a sip from the glass of OJ her father put in front of her, and started digging through the paper for the entertainment section. "Are you okay?" her father asked, concerned. It had been he who had arrived in her room first last night, he who had given her the first reassuring hug. She nodded tiredly. "Yeah." "You didn't have any more nightmares, did you?" She fought off, thinking of telling him the truth. Didn't want to tell him that she hadn't gone back to sleep again. No. "That's good." He put a bowl, spoon, and box of cereal in front of her. "It's catch as catch can this morning, kiddo. I have to get to work early today. Do you want to come with me, or are Keith and Alina gonna give you a ride again?" "I thought I'd ride with Kathy. Her mom's gonna let her borrow the T-Bird today." "T-Bird, huh? You two better not be cruising for guys." "At 7 in the morning. Be serious, Daddy." He grinned. "I'll still be timing you." Lisa poured herself some cereal, doused it with Sweet and Low, and added some milk. Her father left the kitchen, and she found herself listening to the news on the radio. There was another flare-up in the Mideast, a failed coup in Latin America. Locally, 6 infants had died overnight at Lutheran General Hospital. She stopped chewing, remembering her dream. Jack-o'-lantern faces carved on round baby heads. The kitchen felt suddenly cold. She sat still, listening. The babies had died from what was being diagnosed as SIDS. However, the odds of 6 infants dying in one night from this mysterious killer were so astronomical as to be suspicious, and an investigation was being conducted. Lisa looked up and saw her father standing in the doorway. His face was pale, and his mouth was hanging open as if in shock. The way in which he was standing, his posture, reminded her of something or someone, though she couldn't quite... Freddy! Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at her father's face. Their eyes met, and she saw something in his glance that didn't look familiar and that she didn't like. She suddenly felt uncomfortable being alone with him in the kitchen, and was grateful when her mother walked in a moment later. She excused herself as quickly as possible, and after putting on her shoes and makeup and brushing her teeth, she hurried over to Kathy's house. Ed sat in the maintenance office and stared at the blank wall before him. He was worried. He had heard the story about the infants on the news, and while he didn't honestly think that crib deaths in a hospital on the other side of town had anything to do with him, he could not help thinking about the dream he had had last night. He recalled with sickening clarity the details of his dream, the way he had fingers, long fingers, sharp fingers, and the way he'd happily demolished a hospital, joyously carving pumpkin faces on plump baby flesh. In the dream it had seemed fun, exciting, but he had been disgusted with himself upon awakening, frightened at the gruesomely morbid potential of his own imagination. It was as if he had been another person in the dream, not himself, although perhaps that was just his attempt to rationalize the brutality of his subconscious thoughts. He wondered what a psychiatrist would say about it. He continued to stare at the wall. There was something else, too, something that had to do with the dream, something that was eluding the grasp of his waking mind. A girl! One of the high school students? He couldn't recall, but there was a nagging note in the back of his brain, a feeling that the information he had forgotten was more important than what he had remembered. He thought of the expression he had seen on Lisa's face as they'd both listened to the news report, and that, more than anything else, worried and concerned him. She had looked at him as if she was afraid of him, as if she knew what he had dreamed and somehow blamed him for the deaths of those babies. But that was stupid, wasn't it? Wasn't it? There was a beep and a hiss of static as the intercom above the desk clicked into life. It was Nora Hallman, the principal's secretary. "Ed," she said, "are you there?" He pushed the speak button. "I'm here, Nora." "There's been some vandalism in Mr. Kinney's office. Someone, I assume it was kids, threw a rock through his window last night. I already called the district, and they'll send someone out to replace the window sometime this morning. But I was wondering if you or Rudy would come in and clean up a little before the principal gets here. There's glass everywhere, all over the floor, all over the desk, and the rock is lying in one of the chairs. You know how Mr. Kinney is." Ed smiled. He knew how Mr. Kinney was, and he knew that if that office wasn't in perfect shape before he arrived, or as near perfect as possible under the circumstances, he would take it out on Nora and whomever else he came into contact with during the day. "Don't worry, Nora. I'll be there in a minute." "Thanks, Ed." He stood up, pushed from his mind all thoughts of last night, and grabbed his broom. After work, he found himself driving through the industrial section of town, maneuvering easily through the maze of rutted railroad-crossed streets as though he knew the area, as though he had been here before. He had not been here before, had never really seen this area at all except as a dirty series of blocks to the right of the freeway. But now he traveled down the roads and alleys between the massive buildings, driving back and forth and back, looking for something. He did not know what he was looking for, but he knew he'd recognize it when he came to it. He drove past an aluminum recycling plant and what looked like a wrecking yard, then pulled the car over to the edge of the curb and stopped. He stared out the window at the building next to him. It was new, recently constructed, not yet in use, but the contours of its form against the gradually setting sun seemed somehow familiar and friendly. He got out of the car, stretched his legs. There was something welcoming about the structure, something that made him feel warm and good. And he found himself walking up the unfinished and partially paved walkway toward the entrance. The front doors, smoked glass with the factory stickers still on them, were locked, but he'd expected that, and he walked through the small side parking lot, turned the corner of the building, and found what he was looking for, a small metal door deep set in the concrete wall. He tried the door, and it opened. Inside, the building was dark, but his feet propelled him forward, moving instinctively through the huge open room and down a short flight of stairs. He walked through an empty room with white walls, through another, smaller room piled high with unopened crates, past a working air conditioning unit bolted to the floor, then up a series of metal steps where he stopped. Here. Ed looked around. He was in a boiler room, a cavernous chamber filled with hissing steam and rumbling equipment. Everything about him was familiar. The smells, the sounds, the way the shrouded sun shone through the dirty skylight. The building was new, recently constructed, but the boiler room looked old, seemed worn in, and he thought that he had never seen a place that was at once so forbiddingly industrial and so cozily intimate. He looked around, feeling happy, feeling good. He walked around a propane storage tank and stopped in front of a trash incinerator. He touched the warm metal lovingly. It felt just the way he remembered. His fingers sought and found a series of crude indentations. It was here, he remembered, that he had carved his name with the fingers. Freddy! And the names of the little children he had loved. Ed stepped back, shook his head, frowning. What was this crap? His name wasn't Freddy, and he had never been here before in his life. He glanced around, confused. What the hell was he doing inside this building? If someone caught him here, he could be arrested for breaking and entering. How would he explain that to Barbara and Lisa? He turned, intended to leave, to get out as quickly as possible. But his eyes alighted on a hook hanging from a chain attached to a metal crossbeam in the ceiling. He reached out, touched the hook, felt a delicious shiver pass through his body. He wished he'd brought the glove. He blinked. The glove? What the hell had he done with that thing? Hadn't he turned it in to Mr. Kinney? He had intended to give it to the principal, but he could not remember actually having done so. He looked about him. Why was he still here? Why was he still inside this building? He hurried out of the boiler room, through a quick trial and error process, found his way out of the factory. He stepped into the cool night air. Cool night air? Sure enough, the sun was down, the moon was up, the stars were twinkling. He looked down at his watch and was startled to see that it was 8:45. He'd been in the building for 3 hours. He ran around the corner of the building and across the small parking lot toward the street, frightened. Barbara was waiting for him when he arrived. Twin expressions of anger and worry were mingled on her face. But at the moment she saw him, anger gained the upper hand. "Where the hell have you been?" she demanded. "I was about to call the police." He'd been thinking of an answer all the way home, a believable answer, but had come up with nothing. "I was out driving," he said. "Driving?" "Yeah." "You couldn't call and tell me you were, or why you were going to be late?" She did not wait for him to answer. "Driving where?" "Around." He looked over her shoulder, saw Lisa standing in the living room. She was staring at him strangely, frowning, her face worried. He smiled at her reassuringly. "Daddy?" she said. "Mm-hmm." "Where did you get that sweater?" The sweater again. He looked down at his chest, smoothed the bunched material. He hadn't realized that he was wearing the sweater. He didn't usually wear the same clothes 2 days in a row. "I think your mother bought it for me. Why?" "I never bought it," Barbara said. He looked at her, then turned back toward his daughter. "Why?" he repeated. "I don't know. It just reminds me of something." "What?" She shook her head, tried to smile, but failed. "Nothing." "I never bought that ugly sweater," Barbara said. "I wouldn't let you buy that ugly sweater. You must have had it before you met me." She glared at him. "So why were you driving around?" He pushed tiredly past her. "Let's talk about it inside. I'm hungry. I need something to eat." Barbara slammed the door behind him. Both Barbara and Lisa went to sleep early. Barbara angry, Lisa afraid. He sat alone in the living room watching TV. Something was happening here. Something was not right. He could understand Barbara's anger. It was legitimate and totally justified. But for the life of him, he could not understand his own bizarre behavior. And Lisa's fear frightened him. She seemed to be afraid to stay in the same room with him. What the hell was this? A commercial came on, and he walked into the kitchen to get himself something to drink. He took a glass from the cupboard and looked down at the top of the counter next to the sink. Lisa had come in here earlier and apparently made herself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. There was a peanut butter smeared knife lying on the counter next to 3 parallel lines of strawberry jelly, which had obviously dripped over the edge of the bread. He stood there unmoving, glass in hand, staring at the jelly. Those lines on the counter reminded him of something that hovered just below the tip of his consciousness, something he could almost but not quite remember. He stared at the lines. They looked like bloody slashes on skin. He frowned. Why had he thought of that? He swallowed hard and wondered for the first time if there might really be something wrong with him. Violent dreams, violent thoughts, blackouts. This sure as hell seemed serious. He thought of Barbara's Uncle Joseph, who had thought that aliens were spying on him from inside of his TV. They'd thought that he was crazy, that he might have to be committed, but the doctor said that Uncle Joseph's delusions were caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, and he had prescribed medicine that had taken care of the problem. He hoped there was an explanation that simple for what was happening to him. He looked down again at the jelly on the counter and saw razor cuts. What the hell was the matter with him? He forced himself to stare at the lines, trying to see them in a different light, a more innocent light. But the horrible image was in his brain, and he could not make it go away. Angrily, he wiped up the jelly and threw the dish rag into the sink. He got his drink and walked back out to the living room, very troubled. After band practice, Kathy drove home, turning off Lincoln onto Elm. But her house wasn't there. She slowed the car, peering out the windshield. Her house might be there, but she sure as heck couldn't find it because of all the homes on the street looked exactly the same. White, two-story wood-frame structures with green trim and picket fences. She drove slowly down the street looking for mailboxes, for children's toys, for house numbers, for something that would allow her to differentiate one from another, but the similarities seemed to be exact. She began to feel afraid. Outside, the houses looked cheerful, but underneath that surface brightness lay something dark and defiantly wild, something that made her feel nervous and profoundly uncomfortable. She stared at the houses as she drove past, and their facades suddenly seemed to her like false fronts, pretty pictures covering sites of rot and decay. She was certain that eyes were watching her from behind the windows of the houses. Now she was very definitely afraid, and she noticed for the first time that there were no other cars on the street, no sign of all other people. She felt trapped in the neighborhood, cornered. She knew she had to escape, even if it meant returning to school, and she sped up, turning onto Washington. But here again the houses looked exactly the same, cookie-cutter copies of those on Elm. She turned onto Birch, onto Jackson, onto Cedar, but the houses were all alike, and soon she lost track of where she was. Now there were no street signs on the corners, and the sky was a brilliant unshadowed white. Down each street were the twin rows of identical houses. She stopped the car and saw one house that did not look like the others. It was low, one story, and had been painted a gaudy pink that had long since faded into off-white. She got out of the car and ran toward the house, taking the porch steps two at a time, and pushing open the torn screen door as she dashed inside. The inside of the house was one room, a huge, darkly paneled room filled with beautiful antiques. Against the far wall, an old woman sat in a high-backed leather chair. She beckoned to Kathy. "Come here, child," she said. Her voice was old and kind, filled with the warm tones of a loving grandmother. Kathy moved toward her through the room. Halfway to the old woman, she began to see that the beautiful antiques were not quite as beautiful as she'd originally thought. The framed prints on the wall detailed acts of torture and perversity. The lace-covered tables were hosts to fetters and branding irons and wicked knives. The chairs had nails protruding points upward from their seats. The old woman smiled. Next to her, Kathy saw, was a metal seat on which a filled porcelain bedpan was balanced. The bedpan was dripping slowly onto the floor. "Hi," Kathy said tentatively. "Hello," the old woman said. This close, she no longer looked so grandmotherly. Her voice no longer seemed so kind. "Would you like a doll?" She gestured to the right, and Kathy saw a young girl wearing a white dress seated on the carpet. The girl giggled, a corrupt, knowing giggle. She smiled slyly. She sang in a strangely seductive voice. There was something about the child's emphasis on the word coming that made Kathy's blood run cold. "Where's the doll?" Kathy asked. "I'm the doll," the girl said, lowering her eyes shyly. "Freddy's coming," the old woman said, and she seemed to take pleasure in the statement. Kathy ran back the way she had come, past the depraved antiques and out the door. And there he was. She stopped in the doorway. It was suddenly hard to breathe. She stared at the monster on the porch. The deep shadows and refracted illumination, which before had served to keep his features in at least partial darkness, were gone, and she could clearly see the smooth, interconnected ridges of burn scars that crisscrossed his face, the repulsive network of melted, discolored skin, reshaped and reformed to match the musculature of his thin, hairless head. He grinned cruelly, small teeth charred and misshapen inside the lipless gash of a mouth.
Kathy,
he said,
I came for you.
Freddy, she thought. His name is Freddy. Before she could move, jump, get out of the way, the monster was on her. A rough hand whipped around her chest, and razors sliced into her stomach. Long, sharp blades that indiscriminately pierced both organs and arteries as his fingers rammed joyously upward through her midsection. Grinning, Freddy thrust his fingers harder, higher, faster, again and again and again. She felt the blood spurt out from the line of identical wounds in hot rhythmic jets that mirrored the slow beating of her dying heart. She tasted the sickening salty flavor of blood in her mouth, smelled the rank odor of bile in her nostrils. Through the swirling haze of pain that enveloped her, she stared into the small hard eyes of Freddy Krueger.
Pleasant dreams,
he said, smiling. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been part 1 of 2 of the short story Miles to Go Before I Sleep from the anthology book Nightmares on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams. Gotta say, this one is a little unsettling. I'm not quite sure what's going on. I'm pretty sure that Ed is Freddy, obviously. But, I mean, why? Why is Freddy Ed? I guess we'll find out in part 2, which I'll be putting out very soon. I'm really looking forward to finishing this story, and then the final story that we haven't done in the book yet, called Lost Roads, Dead Highways, or Dead Highways, Lost Roads. And then I'm going to put out the unabridged version, where all the stories will be in one upload. Anybody who's followed this channel for a while knows that I ended tonight's upload on the perfect line, because that's the first time I think that Freddy in one of the books has actually said the lines, "Pleasant dreams!" That's always been my outro for Freddy Krueger narrations. So it was kind of cool to see him actually say that, and actually get to voice him saying that to a victim in a nightmare where he's killing somebody. Anyways, guys, let me know what you thought of tonight's upload in the comment section below. It took me a while to get this one recorded because it's storming outside. I had to record in between bouts of thunder and lightning and heavy rain. But I got her done, and I'll be back very soon with the conclusion of this story. And then, instead of doing like a Freddy novel this rotation, I'm just going to knock out this one and the final short story from this book, and that'll be the Freddy part of the rotation of novels I do this time around. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that, guys. As always, tonight's upload has been brought to you by our patrons on the Patreon page, Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Cecilia Spears, Sean Campbell, and Hawaii. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. And if you listeners right now would like to help this cause, help me knock out every out-of-print, hard-to-find slasher novel and get it on here in audiobook form, then all you got to do is sign up at the Patreon link in the description below for as low as $2 to $5 per month. You'll not only be helping the channel and help making this mission complete, but you'll also get some great rewards depending on your tier, and early access to certain content that you can only get exclusively early on Patreon, before it's ever on YouTube. Alright guys, I'll be back very soon. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
pleasant